So I'll call us to order at 6:26. And Krista, thank you so much for doing that.
Sure.
I'm just going to keep moving along so that we're not any later than we have to be. At this time, is there any public comment?
Yes.
Sure. If you just want to give your name, and did you sign in on the little sign-in sheet as well?
I did.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Danielle Hill. I am here to kind of follow up on the public presentation at the last board meeting regarding Justin Bouvier's resignation and the petition that we had submitted to you then. Since then, there has been another petition that has been posted and circulated that I've attached here along with the signatures. Basically, I'll just read it. This letter will serve as a formal submission of the attached petition to the members of the school board. This petition is a follow-up to the original concerns that were presented at the previous board meeting. The over 300 signatures that were gathered on the first petition represented the voice of the students, teachers, parents, and public in regard to our great concern of what's happening at Mount Abraham that might result in another member of the administration considering resignation. Despite the fact that Justin has since rescinded his resignation, we, the undersigned members of the attached petition, still feel that there's a great need for a thorough review of the leadership at Mount Abraham, and that's what we're submitting to all of you tonight to consider. And I'll just leave this with you. It's just one copy, but it is. I can get more copies if you need to. But,
Right. Thank you. Is there any other public comment?
I was just also coming to see if there was a follow-up to that meeting, but also glad to come to a board meeting.
Great. Glad you could come in the show.
Thanks.
Thank you. If there's no other public comment, I'll keep moving along. We're down to the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Andrew?
Second.
Okay, Kayla. All right, all those in favor of approving the consent agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. All right, thank you. Move down to executive limitations monitoring report. There is a cover, an updated cover sheet for the financial reports. Do you have one, Patrick?
I do, thank you.
So if you want to pass that around.
And it's just a slight update. There's a slight change to the revenue since the first packet was prepared when this was sent out ahead of the November 27th, I think it was, board meeting. So we figured since we had another meeting tonight, we had an opportunity to just update that slightly.
Are there any questions regarding the financial report? I'll wait till you get that paper in case something pops
Sorry,
up.
Patrick, the link that we have includes that update, that's the updated, no, you're passing it around.
It's coming around hard copy. I
Okay.
don't know that the link is the most up to date.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that got changed or not. I'd have to follow up on that.
Did you get it? Did it make it wrong?
Did it go to the other side?
Or should it make it?
Yeah, it's getting there.
Okay.
Did you get it? Oh, okay. There's just something else. Nope, that's it.
Extras? I don't want to rush you through it if there's, but I want to keep moving, so.
I can give you just a quick summary to that if that's helpful as you're reviewing it. So it's still early on in the year. there are a number of things that aren't encumbered. For example, there's a lot of money still in facilities that isn't spent and isn't yet encumbered because we're still working on precisely what it will be spent on. The reality is what this sums up to at this point, our best projection is that our fund balance will be under 800,000 at the end of the year. That's still a very rough number at this point, with much of the year left to go. But that 2,488,000 for sure is not what we're going to end up with as a fund balance at the end of the year. We're pretty confident it'll be under 800. How far under is hard to say at this point.
Caleb?
How does that compare, Patrick, to, is there a comparable thing we could look at with last year in terms of where that fund balance is running?
It's, the last 3 years have been a little sort of over the map. 2 years ago, the fund balance was, I think, about 908,000. Last year's fund balance was a little over 1.5 million. And so now we're projecting at about 800,000, though still really early on.
And this is affected by the health HR?
It's really affected by everything. It's really, in large part, I think it's a function of how early on we're building budgets with little information, and we do the best we can, and then reality comes, and needs are different than what we projected 11 months earlier when we started the process. And the reality is we come in under, and also practice is, given the unknowns, we budget conservatively rather than budget where we routinely deficit spend, which is more problematic than ending each year with a fund balance. And the question, which we'll discuss tonight, relative to Caleb's point, is with a fluctuation in fund balance, what do you do with that fund balance in terms of building the following year's budget? And I have some thoughts that I'll share on that later on when we get to building FY20 budget.
Make sure I don't miss anything.
Okay.
I move we accept the financial monitoring report.
It's just an update, so.
Oh,
Yeah,
excuse me,
we
I
don't
thought
have
we
to take
needed
any.
it, sorry.
Yep, no, we don't have to, I just wanted to give everybody an opportunity with the new information if they had a question to not, to give a chance. So, okay, so then we'll move on to the food service financial report, and that was included in your packet as well. Are there any questions regarding that update? Okay, let me keep going. Update on the strategic plan.
So the update on the strategic plan is that we, at our most recent early release day, we had an opportunity for our entire staff, so faculty, support staff, custodial staff, really everyone, join us over at Mount Abraham to hear a little bit more about the strategic plan in its current somewhat draft form still, though it's toward the final stages of being completed, so no real significant changes anticipated, but really an opportunity for people to see and understand that process. So members of the strategic plan steering committee, two of whom are sitting in this room right now, at least two, had an opportunity to help facilitate conversations it all took place at Mount Abraham, but the groups were building based, just as a way to put people in groups that they're most comfortable in, to really be able to dig into the work of the strategic plan, to understand it, ask questions as we work to bring it to completion. The overall, just hearing from building principals and folks involved in facilitating, it was very well received. There was a lot of excitement around having a plan, something that we could really organize ourselves around and provide us some focus for our work ahead. And now we need to bring that plan to completion. The steering committee meets on Monday of next week to review the notes taken and look at the questions that came up from that reflection time, and discuss ways in which we now advance this plan toward its final stages and really roll it out in preparation for starting this plan next year. So it's really going to happen. It's very exciting. It's been many, many months in the making, and I'm really pleased with the depth of the work that has gone into creating that plan. Very thankful to the nearly 50 people involved in generating the work of the plan. And I'm excited to get it started.
Any questions? Okay, we'll keep moving on. The next item is a discussion item, and it's 2.2, our policy 2.2, treatment of staff. So as a way to sort of direct this conversation, and it was something we talked about at the retreat about how we're gonna get, there's things we need to talk about and how we're gonna get through with it, and not just have, meeting where we go on and on and on kind of thing. So the plan is to try a little protocol with this one. So I see almost everybody has a device that they can pull up 2.2 and take a look at it. So the first thing we'll do is pair up together with two of you, or three if you need to, in a group, and take a look at 2.2. Read through the policy first of 2.2. And then once you read it, note 3 things that you notice about the policy. I can or cannot, whatever,
Join us if you want.
All right.
Go to the website of the school.
Yeah, ANESU website, and you can find.
Oh, you do?
So,
It hasn't been revised.
that-
at that meeting also going to see if we can't figure out how to address the community council topic. But we haven't done that yet, and we have not yet decided on a second budget forum. And I guess maybe after we hear about the budget presentation, we'll need to figure out if this board wants to host additional informational meetings about the budget. Did you guys want anything else?
I thought you were gonna sort of check in about Susan.
Tomorrow.
No, well, with this group, I thought you were gonna just, sort of get a pulse of this group around whether continuing to go with her as the facilitator was, because when we were at that community engagement meeting, you were talking about, I guess that should be something the full board should weigh in on, whether that was the path? Or am I wrong on that?
I didn't remember it that way, but there are a lot of things in my head right now, so did you?
So I guess the way I understood it, so Susan submitted a proposal, it's a 1.5-page proposal to the Community Engagement Committee, but it was, as I understand it, kind of the start of a conversation about what kinds of support she might be able to provide. So I guess my assumption, and tell me if you see it differently, but my assumption is that the conversation tomorrow is to try to understand and maybe discuss together what the nature of that proposal would be.
Right.
I don't believe that the Community Engagement Committee could accept such a proposal without coming back to the full board.
That's right, thank you. Right, so her proposal was a draft that she sort of whipped up very quickly when we asked her to initially host a forum with us in October. And she had said at the time, and then said again, this is really just a draft, kind of off the cuff, but it would be really good to have a conversation with members of your committee to see if this is even what you would be looking for, and then bring it to your board. So I think that's the process we were going to follow, so.
But
It could be helpful if anybody had any feedback that we could share with her tomorrow about how you thought the community engagement went, or anything that we could bring to her from even Patrick, anybody. So if you had thoughts that you'd like us to share with her, that would be good. Or email them to Krista is now the
not yet.
or not yet. Well,
Not yet.
or Caleb either, or correct.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, email them to me.
If you have any thoughts or feedback for Susan about the event, that would be helpful, I think, to be able to share with her tomorrow.
So that brings up the other topic, was that I received Caleb's resignation as chair of the Community Engagement Committee. So, and in your resignation, you said that Krista would be interested in taking over, and Krista has expressed an interest in taking over. So, in order to make that happen and so that work can continue, I can go ahead and appoint Krista as chair of that committee. I'll accept your resignation and then appoint Krista to be the new chair of the Community Engagement Committee.
Does that take you off the committee?
No, I'm planning to stay on the committee for the time being, assuming I can still make all the meetings. I'm planning to. I'd like to, for sure. But Krista's been doing so much, well, everybody, has been, but yeah, I think this will be a good for the forward momentum, and appreciative of that.
Can I say one more thing about? Sure. Before you change topics. So Krista, thanks for putting together what you shared by the link. I think maybe after we get a chance to look at the more detailed comments, it would probably be good to, because we did get a lot of free text comments as well from the survey. I know I didn't get through them yet, and it's always good before we release them publicly just to review them, because sometimes there's things that can't be released or whatever, but if there are comments about specific personnel or such. But I think it would be good for folks to plan, maybe we can share that ahead of the next board meeting or something, because I know people did, I was impressed, like some people wrote like a whole paragraph of thoughts related to budget priorities, and so it's really good to hear from folks.
All right. Did you want to have any more discussion? You mentioned community councils looking at that. Do you want more from the board? Do you want us?
No, I'm sorry, that's listed as discussion, but I think that is going to be, hopefully, that conversation will start.
At the community engagement, and then maybe come
Mhm.
back with a recommendation?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So the second budget forum, it sounds like we'll have a little more clarity on that after we talk about the budget and
Yeah.
figure out where we're going, so
Yeah.
I'm just gonna leave it hanging there for now,
Okay.
and then we'll touch back on it once we get down through things. Legislative update, I have not gotten one, I have not from the VSBA, so I don't think there's anything to update us now. So that brings us to the update on the budget projection.
Yeah, so I came into this budget season pretty optimistic. There's I don't know why, but my default, I guess. And information is coming in. I think part of why I was thinking that, I think part of why I was optimistic was there was an error last year in our sort of counting of equalized pupils that was going to benefit us this year that I thought would help. And I wasn't forecasting as significant a decrease in equalized pupil as we're now forecasting. So I think those are a lot of the reasons that were making me feel optimistic, and we had made a lot of changes to try and get ahead of what we knew were going to be difficult budget cycles coming forward. I think that's why we sort of did the hard work that we did do last year to get where we are. So I felt like we positioned ourselves well. And then I got information. So I wanted to just sort of walk you through the information I have now, the assumptions we're making at this point, because we are still making a lot of assumptions because we're still waiting on information from the state. But wanted to know what I know at this point, because what I need from the board is a target, and that's the next action item that follows this discussion around our budget projections. So I wanted to start just by sort of recognizing there are somewhat conflicting needs. So at the state level, Governor, I think, is on the right track. Vermont needs to become a more affordable place. We have a lot of our future doesn't look bright if we can't somehow grapple with affordability in the state of Vermont, and so that we can attract and retain young families, fill our workforce that is losing workers every day, address our declining enrollment that we're seeing across the state year after year after year, and education spending in light of that declining student enrollment is a piece to that greater affordability aspect. So that's sort of at the big picture state level, those are some of the things that are underway. And then we have what we have for needs in MAUSD right now. I feel it's a need that we need time to adjust to the recent staffing changes that have been made. I think we need to think about how do we support the strategic plan that's now sort of on the cusp of being enacted. And we have to continue to think about how do we improve and properly care for facilities, most notably in middle high school. So our needs do not necessarily lend themselves to supporting the needs of the state currently. And so I wanted to start with what do we know, and I'll work to what are some assumptions that we're making and kind of go from there. So what we know right now is we do have an excess spending threshold on our cost per equalized pupil. And for those that are relatively new to this budgeting process, and it's a fairly recent shift in building budgets to focusing on a cost per equalized pupil. For a long time, budgets were built looking at prior year expenses and what percent increase, generally speaking, is sort of palatable to the electorate in moving forward to the following year's budget. So it was really about year-over-year increase in expenses that seemed appropriate, reasonable, sustainable from the board's perspective, representing their constituents. The last few years, it's been around the cost per equalized pupil, and I think that's a reaction to our declining enrollment, that we can't continue to see increases in expenses while we're seeing decreases in the numbers of students, and that we need to sort of wrestle with that. So equalized pupil spending is the way we do it now, and there is a threshold where any district that spends above that threshold is penalized for doing so. That threshold for FY20, the budget we're building now for next year, is $18,311. I'll just put out there, we are not in jeopardy of going over that threshold, so I'll take that worry away right now. I'll give you plenty of other worries, but that one I'll take away right now. We had the benefit in our current year of an 8-cent tax reduction from the Act 46, and that was great. And each year that incentive decreases by 2 cents until it's gone. So building FY20, it's a 6-cent tax reduction. We could celebrate that because it is a 6-cent tax reduction. But it is less of a reduction than the previous year, so we're gonna feel that 2% difference on top of everything else going into this year.
Sorry, Patrick, is this going to be able to be linked? I don't need to take it.
Yes, I can definitely link this, absolutely, yeah. So another thing we know, as we talked about before, the fund balance that was applied from FY17 to build FY19 was $909,000. And the fund balance we have available from FY18 to build FY20 is that $1.5 million. We also know that using that entire fund balance to offset taxes is unsustainable. If you remember earlier in the meeting, I said we're projecting right now under $800,000 in fund balance this year.
So that's the same number.
Right.
But it'll be applied in a couple of years.
And so if we applied 1.5 million, all of that available fund balance to offset taxes in FY20, and then let's say next year we end up at this year, we end up at a $500,000 fund balance, we now have $1 million lost revenue that needs to be made up for by increasing taxes or making cuts, on top of any other factors that may have an impact on what we're doing with our spending. So that's a great risk, which is why I'm saying we know it's unsustainable. 1.5 million is not sustainable. We really shouldn't be carrying over $1.5 million year after year after year. And I don't anticipate that we will this year. We also know that enrollment and equalized pupil counts are down and will continue to decline some. Hard to really know exactly how much. And we also know that keeping the same programming and the same staff, not making any changes, that alone, in particular with the decline in enrollment and the decline in equalized pupil, the cost per equalized pupil will go up. Making no changes, the cost will go up. We also know we have this new strategic plan to support, and we know we have facilities that need work. So that's a lot of what we know right now. And we're making some assumptions though. We're assuming right now that our equalized pupil will drop to 147505, and that gives us, if we look over what's projected for next year and the previous two, that's a loss of 118 equalized pupils. If we think about equalized pupils as revenue at 16,000 and change per equalized pupil, that loss of 118 adds up to a significant dollar amount. That is a projection at this point. Equalized pupils are due December 1st from the state. We don't have them yet. I anticipate them any day now. And when we get that, we'll be able to make all the adjustments here, but our assumption is 1,475. And we made that assumption looking at the past year, or really the current year, I guess. What is our ratio of our enrollment and our equalized pupil? And we applied that ratio to what our current enrollment is, sort of projecting ahead to next year. So it's an estimate. I think it's a very reasonable approach to an estimate. Where the actual number comes in is very hard to predict. This is what all of the slides you'll see following assume this 1475. We're also assuming an 11.8% increase in healthcare premiums. which is significant. And all the other things that we don't have much to go on, what you've seen for figures so far assumes a 1% increase. So there are literally dozens, if not hundreds, of additional lines outside of some of the big ones that we don't have a lot to go on. They're in at 1% right now. So there's still some wiggle room there. A lot of those could become zeros, a lot of those could go down, but just to get a ballpark, they're assumed at 1%. And so, again, maintaining programming personnel with the assumptions that we're making right now, keeping everything the same, puts us up about 4% in total expenses. So that's sort of the old way of looking at budgets. We'd be looking at 4% right now.
Patrick, what would be an average of the last 3 or 4 years of healthcare funding increases? You know?
They fluctuate. This is not at all unlike what we've seen in the past. I've seen 13% premium increases, and I've seen 6, 7, 8% increases. So this is within the range.
Okay.
I think it's higher than what was anticipated. And I think that's just a result of really a whole variety of things around the state about where negotiations landed in terms of cost sharing of premiums and out-of-pocket costs.
No, I realize it's not going to be out of control. I'm just curious how it stacked up against other budgets.
Yeah. Any other questions before we start seeing the application of assumptions and what we know?
Staffing levels increases, that sort of thing, is that in the assumptions there somewhere?
Yes, so there are lots of other assumptions. So we've had to make some assumptions about costs for staffing. We have to make some assumptions about where negotiations may settle around salaries and benefits, and so that's all part of the assumptions that lead to leading to what we project to be the total expenses. Lots of assumptions still at this point. And so I thought it might be useful to think about, or at least I anticipated a question could be, so it went up this $1.2 million or so. Where does that all come from? And this is sort of a breakdown of, and again, a lot of assumptions made to get to this point of where that comes from. So about 80% of that 1.2 million is in the salaries and benefits packages. Another tiny percent from transportation. And all that rest of the 18.5%, that 220,000, is in the other dozens and hundreds of lines of figures less than that 17,888.
It's really shocking that the health insurance is such a big chunk of that. I mean.
Yeah. Yep. So I also thought it would be useful to really take a look at enrollment. So again, this is not equalized pupil, this is enrollment in our schools, and to see what's been going on with enrollment over the last 10 or 11 years. And you can see every single year double-digit decreases in the number of students enrolled in our schools, which has a direct impact on the number of equalized pupil, which is what we now use to build budgets. And so 310 fewer students over the last 10 or 11 years, which to put into perspective is larger than Bristol Elementary School. I think Kevin said 256 earlier was the number that's currently housed here. Larger than any other 2 elementary schools combined. It's a little less than half the student body of Mount Abe. It's a lot of kids is what I'm sort of articulating.
Andrew?
So I know as the farther you go out, the more cloudier it gets about enrollment, projected enrollment. But I mean, it's a general trend from this chart. It looks like we're headed down the drain. I mean, is that what it looks like for the next 5 years, 10 years?
It is really hard to know. I don't think we'll ever get to 0 students.
Right. But keep dropping.
Right. My projection was that we just making lots of assumptions, looking at the trends and thinking about the class sizes that we have now, which kind of, there are bubbles and pockets and things like that. I anticipated we would get to a low point of around 1,300. We're not quite there yet, so I do think we'll probably continue to drop a little bit. I don't know that we'll drop much below 1,300, but that's really hard to know.
Yeah.
Especially not more than 5 years.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
these kids aren't even born yet.
I mean, right now what we feel confident about in terms of the incoming kindergarten class, so there are, I think, 107 or 108 current seniors. And right now, we're pretty confident about 81 incoming kindergartners. But there's a lot more work to be done there. So I do think that 81 will grow to be in the upper 80s, maybe creeping up on 90. But even that alone, outgoing seniors, incoming kindergartners, is projecting another drop for next year. There's a lot of other fluctuation in the grades in between kindergarten and seniors. That's really hard to predict. But at least looking at exiting seniors, incoming kindergartners, we anticipate a drop there. When you factor that into the equalized pupil conversation, seniors are weighted more heavily in the formula for equalized pupils than kindergartners are. And really it's not seniors and kindergartners, it's secondary students versus elementary students. So secondary students, so a secondary student without any additional needs is weighted at 1.14 or something like that, equalized pupil, versus an elementary student that doesn't have any additional needs is weighted more around 0.85 or something like that. So that decrease in numbers of students is compounded a bit further in terms of a decrease in equalized pupil because of the weights. We're losing more high weight students and gaining fewer lower weight students.
Are there trends though in the non-age weight of students, non-grade level weight, like so higher need trends when you don't factor in grade level?
I don't know if this answers your question, but at least I'm thinking of your question. We just looked at some data recently that our number of students, so students on IEPs are also weighted more heavily.
Right.
And though we're seeing declining enrollment year after year, the numbers of students who are on IEPs is remaining relatively constant. So the percentage of students in our district that are on IEPs is growing. So that's a trend that we have noticed that does tie back to equalized
How
pupils.
about socioeconomic status? That's another
That's
weight
remaining
or-
relatively constant. We're in the mid 30% range of students on free or reduced lunch, which I know is comparable to Addison Central. I suspect is comparable to Addison Northwest, though I'm not as familiar. That tends to not change dramatically in any brief period of time. That tends to be something, if you see a change, it's a slow change over time. Other questions here before we move on? So I wanted to kind of walk through a variety of scenarios for you to give you a sense of the impact your budget target may be. So what you're seeing here is using all those assumptions that we talked about to lead to total expenses. This scenario applies the entire revenue that's available, that entire fund balance revenue that I talked about, that I'm suggesting is actually a bad idea. But this assumes that's all applied to offset taxes. And it has our assumption about our equalized pupil count. It has us at a 4.83% increase in the cost per equalized pupil. So this is the best case scenario of the 4 scenarios I'm going to walk you through. It doesn't mean that the board couldn't set a different target lower than 4.83%. But this is operating from a position of not wanting to make more significant staffing changes and more significant cuts. We made a lot of changes that we're living with right now that I'm suggesting we ought to live with. And so that's where I started with this scenario. And it's not lost on me that last year's deliberation was should it be a 0, 1, or 2% increase on the cost per equalized pupil? And now we're talking about something significantly larger than that this year.
Patrick? In this scenario, what fund balance are you bringing over, carrying over?
This applies the full 1.5 million fund balance.
Right at the top, that's.
Oh, it's taking all of it.
This is taking all of it.
Okay,
I'll show you my proposed
Got it.
use of fund balance
Got it.
on the next slide. This is using the 908,000 that was used to build FY19, so staying at that same level, which is much more conservative. I still think we may come in under that 908 as a fund balance this year, but we'll be much closer to the 908 fund balance than the 1.5 million fund balance. So that reduction in revenue for building FY21 will be mitigated significantly. I think it'll still be there and we'll have to wrestle with that, but this mitigates that down the road.
And what happens to the rest of the fund balance?
So my proposal would be that we take the rest of that fund balance and we create a capital improvements fund. And we put that 600,000 and change into a capital improvements fund, which we can then build that pot over time. None of us have the crystal ball to know when or if we're ever going to get a bond to fix some of the needs our facilities have. By using some fund balance to start to build some money in addition to what we have in the general budget to try and address some of these needs is a way to potentially accumulate a couple of $1 million to be able to tackle some of these bigger projects that we are unlikely to be able to build into our regular fund.
And we can do that?
We can do that. There's a process and it's probably not surprisingly somewhat complicated, but that'll be a future conversation if that's the direction that the board wants to go.
Chris?
It's practice in a lot of other places to have a capital improvements fund and to identify a fund balance amount that feels sustainable, and any fund balance that you have beyond that goes into the capital improvements fund. That happens in other places.
Oh, okay. Well, I have two questions about the fund balance, and you might have answered one of them. First, I guess the general question, can you remind us the recommended sustainable percentage of your budget that, you'd like to keep in balance, and is what you're proposing in that range?
So there's different theories on this. 3% seems reasonable to me. That means building a budget many months in advance without having lots of information to do so, to be 97% accurate, feels reasonable. And so 3% on 30 million, we're kind of in the ballpark with that 900,000.
And so then my other question was, what you're proposing is to take the full 900,000 and put in capital improvement? Or take like
600,000.
Oh, okay.
So the difference, so
then
use
the
the same
remaining-
908 that we used to build FY19, which feels more sustainable. I don't know how sustainable it really is, but it's way more sustainable than 1.5 million. And to take the $600,000 difference and put that into the capital improvements fund, because you have to do something with that fund balance, and your choices basically are apply it to offset taxes or put it into some sort of a reserve fund. It doesn't have to be a capital reserve fund; it could be a more open-ended reserve fund, but you'd have to put it away somewhere, and that requires voter approval, and that's some of the process that we could talk about if that's the direction we want to go. But there are ways to put that money in a fund that it can grow. It can't stay in the fund for more than 5 years. So that 600,000 would have to be spent prior to that 6th year. Like you have 5 years to spend that, but you can grow it over 5 years and then spend it all to get a big project done. Like, so there's some flexibility in how that works.
But you're significantly reducing what we could use to offset taxes
Exactly.
from what we've done in the past.
Right, so the past practice has been, we apply the entire fund balance from 2 years ago to offset taxes as we build the future budget. And we have yet to have the experience of, and now we have nowhere near what we applied to offset taxes as a fund balance to use anymore, and we've dug ourselves a really big hole that we need to find our way out of. And I'm afraid if we apply the entire 1.5 million, we will be digging a big hole that we'll be finding our way out of when we build FY21.
Steve?
So, let's say we reserve the 600,000, is there a way to have that also act as a rainy day? For instance, if we find we need to apply it down the road, it can be pulled out of that fund.
And that's where there's a few different options. And so we would need to, if this is the direction the board wants to go, we would want to seek some legal counsel. My assumption is the board would want to have as much latitude as it could to utilize that money in that reserve fund to take care of the needs that present themselves. And so we would seek legal counsel to really work through it. I don't think we can avoid that it goes before the voters. That I think has to happen, but there are ways to write articles that the voters would act on that offer more or less latitude to the board to spend that money. So that's part of the process we'd have to engage in to understand what's the way in which to write those articles that need to be approved by the voters that is of greatest interest to the board to be able to use that money.
Did you, Andrew?
So the 7.36 is basically the previous slide, but the use of the fund balance.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's the only difference. Is this is applying 908,000 of the fund balance to offset taxes. The previous slide was using the full 1.5. That's the only difference in these two. And so, as we talked about needs, thinking about the community input, and right now, principals are engaging with staff to collect some input on how do we prioritize the work within the strategic plan, and then what resources might be needed to be able to support that work that has been prioritized. And so I don't know where that's going to go in terms of what identified need is, but remember that this is not making any change. This is no reductions, this is no additions, this is taking everything we have now, rolling it all forward. I wanted to present a couple of scenarios where there's added money to support facilities and or the strategic plan to give you a sense of what that impact would be, just to try and help present a few scenarios to give you what you need to try and set a budget target for me to try and hit. So this scenario, it's the same as the previous one. It's using the recommended 908,000 in revenue, not the 1.5. It uses all the same other information, but it adds 250,000 to the 30 million to support facilities and or strategic planning needs that are yet to be identified. This goes up to 8.37% increase for equalized pupil.
In the last 2 years, there was a line item for like $1 million for facilities, whatever. Is that still in this budget?
It is still in the budget, yes.
So this is over and above that?
Correct. Yep. Sure.
Just that 908 that we applied for the last year's budget, if we apply that this time, that would be about 2/3 of the actual excess fund, so, or a little less than that. In previous years, are you saying that that's typically been 100% of that has been applied? I know you're not
Yes.
recommending that now, but that
It has
is
been.
typical. So the fact that we would be applying something like 60% of it is, would be unusual in that regard, and that's why you would have to get a vote to basically not apply that.
Right.
If we did that, and let's just say it went into a facilities investment account or whatever, or savings account, is there an investment? Like, is that money that's going to grow if it's sitting somewhere, or is that money that's just gonna basically sit somewhere, so it's got really low risk, but it's basically not gonna grow? Because I'm just thinking, given how the cost of construction goes up all the time, and net present value of money being what it is, maybe it's better to just spend that money on the building rather than put it into a bank account where it's not gonna gain significant interest.
Yeah, and that's definitely something we'd have to weigh. The trick is, 600,000 sounds like a lot of money. It won't get us very far in terms of tackling a significant project, even just at the high school, let alone trying to tackle anything across 6 different schools. There are a number of, if you sort of dig into the work that was presented through Dora Whittier, there are a number of components of work that, so HVAC, if we take that alone, If we needed to replace the HVAC system, which I think it's the perspective from some that perhaps we will need to do that, or we should do that, the HVAC system is one component, and then digging into the building and the scope that would have to be dug into the building to change that system, the cost starts to compound. And so even the $1 million plus the 600,000 may be insufficient to address the HVAC system. So while you're right, we're not going to gain the interest in a bank account that we, to offset the increase in the cost of construction, the logic could be we need to save up enough money to be able to tackle some of these projects, even though we know that the construction costs are going up. We can't tackle those big ones without saving up to get sufficient funds to do that.
And that's precluding a bond. I mean,
Right.
Right.
Allison?
Yeah.
So, we applied 908,000 from 17 to the 19 budget, which means essentially the $1 million that we had in the construction line, if you look at it that way. So, right now, the construction line has nothing in it. If you do the 1.5 and take out the 908,000, that leaves a total fund carryover balance of 600,000, which essentially gets spread across everything, including the construction line. Does that make sense? So we're not seeing the first $1 million still in the construction line, plus 600,000 for the rest of everything else. That $1 million that we initially put in for the bond is just rolled up into all of the other.
There is still $1 million in construction services in a line, yes. And what we do with the fund balance doesn't change that. We could use the entire fund balance to offset taxes. There's still $1 million in the construction services line. We could put 600,000 into a capital improvements fund, and there's still $1 million in the construction services line. We would have, though, with that 600,000 in the capital improvements fund, we'd have the $1 million and the 600,000. And if the following year we had another 500,000 that we could add to that, we'd have the $1 million plus the 1.1 million in the capital reserve fund. And that capital reserve fund can grow. No money can stay in there longer than 5 years. So if we put money in this time, that has to be spent in 5 years, but the money we would put in next year has to be spent 5 years from next year. So we can grow that over time, add it to what we have in the general budget, and tackle some bigger projects.
So how much of the $1 million that was in the FY19 budget got spent?
So FY19 is this year, so
Right,
we haven't
okay.
spent it all yet.
Do we
The money we
project
had in
spending it?
FY18, we spent every dime of it.
We spent all of it in 18, and we project spending all of it from 19?
In 20, in 21, in
Yeah.
22.
So that's not money, that contributes to the excess fund?
It is not.
Really?
Krista?
I was just thinking that we're starting to hit my ceiling of understanding, so I wonder if,
There's another slide.
yeah.
So this is rolling everything forward using the recommended fund balance of 908 and adding 250 to support strategic plan, facilities, etc. And this is the same concept, only now the 250 is 500, just to give you a sense of where this goes. And that's 9.43% increase in the cost per equalized people.
And now we're bumping up against that excess spending
Threshold.
threshold.
We're at 17.9 there, and it's 18.311, so we're still $400 away, more or less. So it's getting closer, but $400 is still, especially when you look at, if we go back to the very best case scenario, it was 17.1. So with all of those additions, which amounts to almost $1.5 million or better, or $1 million or better, it jumps up 800. So we're definitely getting closer to it at this high end with the addition of 500K. But not close enough that the unknowns are going to put us over the threshold. equalized pupil is not gonna come in so much lower than what we're projecting that it puts us over the threshold. Our estimation on expenses is not gonna come in so much over that it's gonna put us over the threshold. So this is, I wanna say conservatively under the threshold, but it doesn't cause me concern of exceeding the threshold. But it for sure is closer.
Jen?
So it seems to me that the reserve, the capital reserve fund, capital improvement fund is going to be difficult to explain, particularly if it's something that people are gonna actually have to vote on. I think it's gonna be even harder to explain why we would be taking $600,000 that we already have and putting that in a fund and then adding effectively the same thing to the, it's like, almost like, it feels to me, just on the surface, like people are gonna feel like they're being taxed twice. Like, you're taking the money you already have and you're not using that, and then you're asking us to give you that much more money. Like, I think it's conceptually gonna be really hard to explain. And, I mean, I just, like, those are some really big numbers on the slide, like really big increases. I don't know, in the years I've been on the board, if we've ever proposed an increase. I'd have to look back, maybe 1 year.
I have one more piece to try and contextualize this that might be useful. So I imagined, a question could come up, what would a 1% increase on equalized pupil look like? Because this is along the lines of the conversation from last year. So looking here, you can see, so this is just compared to our ed spending. So remember that ed spending is your total expenses less your revenue. That gives you your education spending. It's your education spending that is then divided by your equalized pupil to give you your cost per equalized pupil. Important to note that in ed spending, that $1 million we have in construction services counts against us in terms of our cost per equalized pupil. If that $1 million was applied to a bond payment, it would likely be waived, and that $1 million comes off of our cost per equalized pupil. That was part of in my sort of roadshow talking about the bond 2 times ago, tried to make that point really clear that that it has an impact there in terms of keeping us even further away from the spending threshold because of the waiver we would get to not have to count that against the equalized pupil. But this is just comparing to what we currently spend in ed spending right now. We would be decreased to get a 1% increase in the cost per equalized pupil with our projections. We'd be under what we're spending now in ed spending. It would be this much under scenario 1 that I showed you, which uses the entire fund balance. It would be $1.5 million under the scenario where I suggested that we would use the recommended fund balance, but not add any money, and then 1.78 and $2 million. That's the kind of reduction we would need to make in ed spending in those 4 scenarios to be at 1%. And I probably don't have to describe to you the impact that would have. It's more significant a reduction than we made last year to this year.
Do you have the numbers? If you go back to the old-fashioned budget increase over last year,
4%. So this figure,
4%.
that was,
Okay.
so this is assuming, so this doesn't assume the 250 or the 500. This assumes that we're not adding. This is just rolling programming and personnel forward with no changes to that. Puts us at 4% in total spending year over year.
And that would put 900,000 as rollover and the other 600 into a capital fund?
Correct.
Can,
So that 4% would be, well, so I take that back. So that has an impact on, now we're getting toward ed spending. This is total expenses. So what we do again with that fund balance doesn't impact total expenses. Impacts ed spending. Let me pull up one of these other slides.
I'm just thinking about
Oh,
the person on the street, which, that's where I'm at. And,
Yes.
and they're so accustomed to thinking, well, how much more this year than last
right,
year?
that's
I mean,
Yep.
and when.
And so this is looking, so you can see here, this is our total expenses FY 17, 18, 19, 20. And you can see we reduced our total expenses by $1 million FY 18 to FY 19. And our projection is that keeping programming and personnel as is we'd be increasing by almost $1.2 million, which is about 4% from this year. Interestingly, it's next to no increase from where our expenses were 2 years ago. So a different way to look at expenses would be, and this is an argument that could be made in the old days of building budgets looking at expenses, I think in most places it would be considered quite a success if over the course of 3 years you kept your spending the same. That's effectively what you're seeing here is there was a drop this year and it came back up, but to have your budget 2 years later be the same as it was 2 years ago would be a pretty significant success. Especially considering that making no changes means it goes up $1 million. We happen to, and in the era of equalized pupil, keeping your expenses the same while equalized pupils going down means you can be doing the hard work and you're still going to be seeing increases in your cost per equalized pupil.
Just working over a few people.
Exactly.
So could you tell us so you said status quo is a 4% increase. Could you guesstimate the other proposals and what the overall increase is there? Like you did the equalized pupil increase, but
Yeah, so
what is the?
So 300,000 is 1%, right? So the 250 basically adds 1%. The 500,000 adds almost 2%.
Okay.
So it'd be 4 or 5 or 6%, rough ballparking the increases.
And do we have any historical information about the highest percentages we've ever passed in this district?
In terms of total expenses, I'd have to look up what has passed here. Generally speaking, from my days of building budgets looking at total expenses, 2 or 3 or 4% was about what you were looking at year after year.
Mm-hmm.
I think in any given year over a 10-year span, you probably saw something in that range 9 out of the 10 years.
Andrew?
And since I'm new to this process, so what happens if we go out to the voters with a number that they vote down?
Then
What kind of heck
you
is that?
can present the same budget again, one time, but in past, it doesn't pay to present the same budget a second time,
Okay.
because they were unhappy with it the first time, they'll get really unhappy if you try it again. So you have to make changes. And typically in the past, what they want is it to go down. So you Patrick will spend the time chipping away till you find a place where it's acceptable.
And I will say, I think your question was, so what's the impact if we did that? The logistics of it aren't hard, so we go back to the drawing board, we figure out, so what's a lower number that we think would be palatable,
Okay.
and we figure out how to get to that. The unsettling impact, and so it was fairly recently that we had a budget that failed, right? Mount Abe's budget, I think, failed 4 or 5, 6 years ago.
Bristol.
We had like
Maybe it
2 or
was
3
Bristol.
towns that
Bristol.
failed all at once.
And so you probably recall, it's not fun at all. It's unsettling, there's a lot of guesswork, there's a lot of assumptions. It's very unsettling for the organization to have failed the budget and be trying to figure out, because then you're now in really April and May, which is really late in the process, having to make some really hard decisions, and people get very little information. Like, so if we had to make significant reductions to get to whatever we thought was the target that the voters would pass, we're now doing that in April or May versus November, December, and that adds to a great deal of anxiety in an organization.
Allison?
And you also have to remember that the first budget that you present, there will be people unhappy with the amount of money they perceive as not being spent. They see being crucial and it's not being spent. So when you come back with a second budget that's lower, they become even angrier, and then they bring in friends. So, you appease the people who want a lower number, but you infuriate the people who want to at least maintain the programming and personnel that you have, and now you're talking about cutting it. So you bring more people into that fold. And it becomes, every time we do a budget, we have to reduce it. If it doesn't pass, we have to reduce it. But that makes people mad.
You don't have to reduce it, that just
You don't
9
have to,
times out
but
of 10, that's what
that's
is
really the
done.
only option we have. So it doesn't get any better. The budget doesn't get any better from the first one you submitted, unfortunately.
Caleb?
What's going on with the revenue line? I mean, I know it's complicated, but we've got equalized pupils tracking downward in general. Revenue is keyed largely in my understanding off of equalized pupils. So I'm understanding kind of the drop from 18 to 19, but where'd the big increase come in 17 to 18, and now it looks like we're going back up in revenue this year. So how do those changing revenues kind of seesawing track along with equalized people, which seems to be going one direction?
So it doesn't track along very well, I think, is the answer, and that's the hard part. So for the most part, the revenue that you're seeing is estimated to be the same as the revenue in FY19, because we don't really have a lot of information to go on beyond that. And so revenue information is something that will continue to come in likely after this board passes a budget, or at least adopts a budget to send to voters. So that will continue to shift. And even when the voters pass a budget on town meeting day or thereafter, revenue will continue to change. So it is definitely something that continues to move. I'm trying to remember the significant changes from FY18 to FY19, because it did drop 900,000. And they're not
I remember
coming
you
to
explaining it.
What's that?
I think I remember you explaining it.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember what the details of it were.
Was it a change in the block grant, or that portion?
The biggest, so the two most significant contributors to revenue are special education reimbursements and fund balance that's applied. So those are the two. So again, if we're talking about 900,000 of that 4 million is fund balance, that's almost a quarter of what's there. And the special education revenue that's generated in any given year is in the millions. So 3/4 of that revenue is accounted for in just special education revenue and fund balance revenue.
Jen?
So I just wanted to say, I think sometimes it's easy to think about getting revenue based on the equalized pupil, but that doesn't actually show up, that's not counted as revenue in the budget. It's backwards, because you take the expenses and divide it by your equalized pupil and you get a cost, and you you don't actually get paid that. But it took me a long time to come to that, making that make sense. So I wanted to comment on that, and then I wanted to just sort of share my general reaction, since we've been looking at these numbers for a while. So my feeling is that I think that we made a lot of cuts and a lot of changes to the staffing last year, and I really support the idea that we need to let things be for a year, another year. I think it would be really hard to go back and ask for more cuts. So I really appreciate that we're not looking at a budget that has a lot of cuts in it. I think you caught that with your points there, that the organization is working out how to work in this, the way it's set now. That being said, I just cannot imagine being able to support anything other than either the first or maybe the second scenarios that you have here. I can't see that. I don't think I could go to the voters and say, I think you should, accept something with this much of an increase. So that's my personal feeling, and maybe I'll change my mind between now and when the time comes, if that's what we adopt as a board. But I mean, even a 7% increase on equalized people is a big increase. It's a big increase.
Andrew?
So to echo some of your thoughts, Yeah, I don't like the idea of cutting additional staffing and letting the system stabilize this year. And I'm really concerned if we did cut about the morale of teachers. I think they would probably like to know that this year they can go about their business and do their job, not worry about their jobs. I like the capital improvement plan, using the carryover funds. And although I think 9.43 is probably asking for trouble, there's also part of me as a taxpayer that says 7.38 is the number that we should go out with. And I don't know how we can message this to the community, but, or 7.36, but that since I don't necessarily want to tie it to the bond, but the fact that we haven't passed the bond doesn't mean that the school and its infrastructure needs goes away. And so that has to be we have to think differently now. If we're not going to pass a bond, we have to have money available to fix sudden emergencies that probably are incredibly expensive. So, 7.38 feels, and maybe that's floating with fire too, but.
Steve?
Is there a little way to, Patrick, to split that 600,000 to maybe get in between the 7 and the 4? If you needed 250 of that for supporting the strategic plan, and maybe bump up the balance forwarding a little bit more than you're comfortable with, so you can get a little bit of both out of that.
Yeah, this board for sure has the latitude to apply $0 of the fund balance to offset taxes, or 100% of the dollars to offset taxes.
Well, I think
anywhere in
to
between.
speak to Jen's concern that we're sort of saying we're not going to do our normal thing of forwarding all the balance, but then we're going to ask for more money. If you were to say, hey, look, we're not going to do our normal thing, and the reason why is because we're going to support, the strategic plan, and we're going to support a few construction dollars, but we're not going to ask you for more money. We're not going to have a new fund. That might be a way to, and add some of Andrew's selling points to it as well. We're doing this because we're not asking for a bond.
Yeah. I think we'll do what we can with the money we have for facilities, whether it's in the general fund budget or it's in a capital improvements fund. My greater concern about what we do with the fund balance that we have is about sustainability and what kind of a hole are we going to dig ourselves. Like I cringe at the thought of sitting here this time next year facing a $2 million reduction, which is my fear if we apply all 1.5 to offset taxes.
So that applying it to a capital funds plan is not new. We did do it when we were individual towns. Not every town did it. Moncton didn't do it.
Mount Abe and Bristol did though.
Mount Abe and Bristol approved it, and they set money aside, and that's how some of the money. That's
how we fixed the gym floor.
How we fixed the gym floor. Was that money was set aside. So it has been done. Not all the towns did it, but it was put on. It was on the annual meeting agenda as an item for passage at the annual meeting, and so it has been done before.
And those two boards, the language was written very different for each of those boards, and so the steps each of those boards had to go through to access that money that it put in those funds was different. And that's where, if we go this route, really thinking about what does that language need to look like will be important.
People a better feeling that you're not just spending more money and having less kids to teach.
Do you have more slides that you want them to see?
I did have, just a couple more, I think. So this one really sort of articulated what 1% would look like. And I think we've talked about my recommendations already, that we should apply the same fund balance to offset taxes, and that would put 610 in the capital reserve. And my desire to resist setting a target that would require additional staffing reduction. So I feel like we've kind of addressed those along the way. And those were the last of my slides, I think. Yep.
So just to, that scenario is the 736 or the?
So the one that's up here now is the 736, which is the proposed fund balance that I'm proposing, and putting the rest in the capital improvements fund.
And no monies for the strategic plan.
Right,
or
so this doesn't, this
no
wouldn't-
additional.
No additional.
Or maybe you split that somehow.
And again, I do want to just remind, these are still soft numbers. Once we have some traction, the ability to go back and massage numbers, and we'll get firm equalized pupil, there's a lot more work to do. So this 7.36 in this scenario could become something smaller. It's not going to become 1%. It's probably not going to become 2 or 3 or 4%. But it could get smaller than what it is now. I suspect if it changes this scenario, the percentage gets smaller. We tend to start more conservative.
Smart move. Jen?
So, so in the interest of time, obviously this being a really important conversation, so I think that what you're looking for is for the board to take an action on a specific budget target. So I guess I could make a motion if people are ready for that to happen.
I've got just one more question. If you go back to the previous slide, that was what, 4%? So this,
Almost 5, yeah.
so this slide would be applying the 1.5 in revenue.
The entire.
Okay.
And so Steve's point, could we split it somehow? It would be somewhere between 5 and 7.
Just quick question, sorry. The 600,000 in increases in education space, because there was like about 300,000 in just the increase from the health insurance, and then there was about 600,000. I think you've broken it down. You have the 54%. What's the nature of that increase year over year? Is that just like kind of a standard contracted annual increases?
So we,
Or is it new positions?
in building this year, we could calculate that more precisely because we had a negotiated agreement. We don't have a negotiated agreement for next year, so we can't apply what we know. So we had to make some assumptions to what salaries could end up at. We don't really know where salaries are gonna end up.
How big is that range, do you think? That 6 foot, you know, I mean, is that like a, how did you arrive at that number in that projection?
I'm happy to disclose that, but I want everyone to know that
That's a negotiation.
that's negotiated, and there are potential disadvantages to disclosing that right now.
It's just a big percentage of the increase we're talking about, so I just, I guess interested to know whether we think it's a really real number. I hear what you're saying.
I think it's a real number.
I was gonna say, could we generally say that it was probably based on historical data that you used
Absolutely.
to make assumptions?
Yeah. I think between 2.5% and 3.5%, like if we look at a range historically, it's almost always somewhere in there. And then that's salaries, but then there's FICA, and there are a number of things associated to increases in salaries that have sort of a trickle effect, and those are all factored in here as well.
But that number is in that range of a 2.5% to 3.5% increase in the total comparable spending from the year.
Yep. And the 313 is based on what we know now about current employees' selection of health insurance, and then applying the 11.8% increase to that. Transportation, we know that we have a multi-year contract, so we know what the increase to next year is. And then there's a lot of other lines that make up the difference.
So really, even if we didn't do anything, you're gonna be looking at 3%, 2 to 3% anyway.
If we did nothing,
Without a
we're
staff
looking at
reduction.
5%. So because of the decrease in equalized pupils, do nothing is a 5% increase almost, or 4.8, whatever that was. That's your make no change
Right.
and apply the entire fund balance.
I mean, even if all the other metrics stayed the same, the pupil stayed the same, everything stayed the same.
I started building this with some scenarios that kept equalized pupil the same, and then I realized that's
Yeah.
a little too Pollyanna even for me.
Jen? So I'd like to make a motion that the board request the superintendent to work towards the budget target as shown in scenario 2.
the Patrick recommendation.
I'll second that.
I second.
All right. So Jen and Sarah,
And can I just ask, was that motion sufficiently?
is that enough?
I have what I
of a
need,
target?
yes.
Any more discussion?
I didn't want to put it in the motion, but in my discussion, I would not be at all sad should that 7.36 be less the next time we talk about it. But I feel like of the different options you presented, that I think this one felt like the most reasonable one to move forward with.
So in my discussion, that number would stay the same if you split the 600,000 more than just, like you could split it into a couple other pockets. Like you're gonna take the 600,000 in this scenario and I'm forgetting how exactly.
This scenario applied to 908 or 909,
Right.
whatever it was, and assumes the other 600 or 610, whatever it was, goes into something like a capital reserve fund.
Right. Does anybody have any comment on splitting that, say, towards strategic plan, construction?
Allison's.
So right now, we have no money in a capital reserve fund, correct?
Correct.
So by putting that 600,000 in the capital reserve fund, it shelters it from it keeps it out of our calculation. So if you were to split that, you'd put 300,000 back into our budget, which increases the percentage that we're looking at, and then leaves.
Decreases. Because we're talking now, not an amount to add to the budget, but an amount that we take away because we're applying it to offset taxes.
Right.
Oh, right, yep. So
Or,
technically, we'd be doing 1.2 million if you did half and half.
well,
You
no,
did the
actually,
900,000
I'm
plus
saying
half
that
of
we
the
could split
six.
the 600,000 into, and
Okay.
that might violate what you're saying. I mean, we could split it up, whatever pockets would make some sense.
You're
to
still
help.
saying only use the 900 to offset taxes,
Right.
so let's talk about a
What to
variety
do
of
with the
options to do
remainder.
with the
Sure,
600.
like, let's have some momentum with the strategic plan.
Krista?
I would advocate for keeping it in a capital improvement plan. I think that there is a lot of conversation about deferred maintenance and a lot of concern about the state of our schools and the lack of or perceived lack of attention to that over the years. And so I feel like with the right wording, it would not be that hard to sell. And I fully support the strategic plan, but I think this is a really good opportunity to do what probably should have been done a long time ago.
And I think there's a procedural component that we'd need to look into for sure. My suspicion is it likely requires voter action to access the money we put into a capital reserve fund. And so if we created some other education reserve fund that required voter action to support the work of the strategic plan, I feel like that's a harder piece to have folks understand the impact. When we're talking about a facility, we need new windows, we need a new roof, we need a new boiler. That's a little more concrete to say that's where we want to use those funds. And there's plenty of need to apply however much money we might want to put into a capital reserve fund.
Any other comments, concerns around the motion to adopt the budget target? Okay. All those in favor of setting the budget target, to have the superintendent work towards budget target outlined in scenario 2, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. All right, would you like to table student reps and staff reps on the board again?
Yes,
Yes. All right, I'll just need a motion to table that till December.
So moved.
All right, Andrew, is there a second?
Yes.
Amy?
And,
All right,
can I make one comment?
sure.
I think both student reps and staff reps, if you do a close look at the community council model, we'll have much more flexibility in discussing stuff without being bound by the board format. Just wanted to throw that out there.
This is just on tabling. Yes, Jen.
Well, I'll wait till you have the vote on that.
Okay. All right, all those, and then in favor of tabling student reps on the school board and staff reps on the school board till the next meeting, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. Did you have something, Jen?
Well, I just was wondering, because when we were on the community engagement, we said that we would probably talk more about the second budget forum. When we were on the budget topic, I suppose we could probably talk about under modifying the board work plan. But I don't know, I'm kind of looking at Krista, whether the community engagement committee feels like it needs any direction about a second budget forum. I'm just thinking that, you know, last year that the timeline that happened was like the first week of January. So were we to desire to have something in that time frame that's only a month away, so that we couldn't decide that at the next meeting and make that happen in early January. So I don't care if we talk about it now or under the board work plan, or if Krista, if you think that it's fine and we can just talk about it at the community engagement committee.
Were you saying, we can discuss it, but it's too short of a timeline?
I just didn't know if the community engagement committee needed any direction from the full board tonight about the desirability and timeline for another budget forum. Because if it's gonna happen in January, we really shouldn't wait till our next board meeting.
Oh, board meeting,
The
okay. I
next
thought you
larger
were,
board meeting to decide that, like, you know, I think it's on the 18th or something, the next meeting.
In 2 weeks.
And so that would be like a 2-week notice over the holidays to plan an event. And so that would,
Hmm.
I mean,
so,
I
yeah.
think, I feel comfortable that we could decide what makes the most sense in our committee. If the board assumes that we want to have some kind of engagement around this, then.
Liz?
Does you have, are there any other plans to have any budget presentations? Cause is it the board that would be doing a budget? I mean, I guess last year being my only experience, I felt like you kind of, so I guess what, would it be us who should be in charge? Cause I know that they were on the work plan to have community engagement around the budget. So is that something you're working on or planning, or is that something we should be doing?
I think it's for the board to decide in what way do we want to engage the community around the budget. So there was some proactive work done to get some input about budget priorities. But I think there historically has been a desire from the community to have an opportunity to see and understand what's the budget that's going to be presented in at town meeting day, or at least have an idea of what's the draft, and for the board to get some feedback on the draft, which is a little more concrete than the input we have had so far, to possibly make some changes before it's adopted by the board in January. And so I think that's why last year the idea was to have a community forum to present the budget and its details and its impact in early January, so that the board could consider making some changes before adopting in the end of January.
And then you just have a really significant role in that, of course. Okay, awesome.
And I'd be happy to do that again.
So maybe as a quick way, I mean, what do board members think? Yes, we need a budget forum at the beginning of January? Is that what everybody's saying?
Yeah, I mean, it's a discussion item on our agenda
Yeah.
anyway, we just put it off until.
At some point through here, I think we need to
Yeah.
I think we can
communicate
assume we need
what-
to do
Yes.
that, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm good.
Okay. So there, we took care of that one. Okay.
And I do think there's another point of clarification. And is it the community engagement committee that holds some responsibility for picking the date and working with me to get a presentation together, et cetera?
Was that was how it was handled last year, or not? Was it just dealt with through the?
There wasn't a community engagement committee at this time last year, I don't think.
Yeah, it's full board.
I kind of feel like Patrick really made most of that happen last year, the budget meeting. That's how I remember doing.
We can talk about it tomorrow, see what we can do.
So it sounds like we're gonna do it tonight. Make it happen.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little concerned. You know, we need to spend a chunk of our time tomorrow hashing out this relationship we may have with a facilitator, and we've already taken on a lot as a committee, so I want to make sure we're sort of spreading the wealth of opportunity to be involved in this process. So, I mean, I'm comfortable with our committee setting a date and making sure that works with Patrick, but I don't know if there's a way to make it equitable, because it gets to be, yeah.
And I'm happy, so I'll be building a more detailed presentation, probably something similar to the kind of presentation I've done in the past around a budget for you to see in less than 2 weeks from today.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that will evolve over time prior to the January date, but more or less what you're gonna see as a presentation would be similar to what I would present at a community forum and have some Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's not a stretch for me to do the planning. I just don't wanna make assumptions that, I don't wanna overstep my role in community engagement since we now have a community engagement committee, and
Yeah.
there may be a different approach that committee wants to take or this board wants to take.
Jen?
Well, I wonder if there might be 1 or 2 people from the board who would be interested in kind of spearheading, planning the event, and then they could get support from the community engagement committee as needed. And that might be another way to look at moving it forward. I find generally planning an event is usually done very efficiently by 1 to 2 people, because they can discuss details without needing to be in a warned meeting, for example. It would be another option. I see everyone's jumping out of their chair with excitement about that.
Dawn?
Yes.
So last year, we didn't have a committee put together the budget forum presentation, correct? We, essentially, Patrick, you and your office put that together. We picked a date and put it out there, so maybe this year we could continue that, giving the communication, or the community engagement committee. I feel like this is a little bit different from your purview, the engagement committee. It's very budget oriented, not so much, anyway, just having, continue it the way we've done it in the past.
And it's not a problem for us to organize that out of our office and do the doodle poll to see what works for board members and all of that. The one piece that I think is important not to lose is it isn't my budget. And just making sure that it's evident in the forum that it's the board's budget. At least the dollars spent.
Krista?
Right, and I think it's also important that we hear the connection between feedback we've gotten and the priorities that we're setting out. So that part, I think, is our responsibility as well.
And the trick, given the slight delay to now and then the earlier meeting in December for the holidays, is with a target, I now have less than 2 weeks to get that together to present back to you. But that's going to be the mission now, is community input, staff input, realities of the strategic plan, bringing it all together with the realities of the financial situation, and see what we can.
That's what we'll see on the 18th, or that's the
That's
whole
my goal,
idea.
yeah.
So,
Jen?
So, since no one else is volunteering, I would volunteer to be a board member point of contact to help with
So will I.
any planning.
Great,
I'll help too.
thank you.
And since I connect with the community engagement committee, I can link with them if needed. But
One thing that does come to mind that would be really useful, that I think connects to the community engagement committee, is with this addition of several hundred pieces of information from the survey, to somehow put that together into something, not so much differentiating the online versus the in-person, like really all together, what is that telling us? And that would, I'd appreciate that soon, just
Yep.
given my timeline,
Yeah.
so that I can start to build that in.
I can do that piece, Patrick.
Great, thank you.
All right. Let's see, we are, an action item, monitoring report for 3.4, monitoring superintendent's performance, so I need a motion to accept that.
So moved.
Andrew moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Steve? All right. Any discussion? Caleb wrote that report, so it was included in your packet. Any comments? All right. Liz?
I thought it was pretty good, thank you for doing it.
Ditto.
All right. Okay, based on the information provided, did you find that the interpretation was reasonable?
Yeah.
Yep, all right. And did the data demonstrate the accomplishment of this interpretation? All right. All those in favor of accepting 3.4 monitoring report, monitoring the superintendent's performance, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. All right, next is to accept the board monitoring report for 4.4 school board chair's role.
So moved.
Who is that? Allison, sorry. All right, is there a second?
I second.
Andrew? All right. Any discussion, comments?
I didn't really have anything of substance to say about the report, only in that it seemed a little odd that you were monitoring yourself.
Yes, it did. It was odd to write it.
Naval Nathan.
That seems like something we may want to think about in the future.
And it also brought me to the realization that probably on the board evaluation, there should be a little question there, some sort of feedback to the board chair at that, on that evaluation piece as well, because that would be useful when you're preparing this monitoring report, to have a little monthly info to include. So watch for that to come. Any other? Okay. Based
Are you
on,
writing that in the official feedback?
I will.
You should.
And if you just get to me whatever that question wants to look like, I'll work with Karen to get it on a new survey.
I think I have one somewhere. All right, does the board find that the interpretation is reasonable? Did the data demonstrate the accomplishment of this interpretation? Okay. All right, all those in favor of accepting for the board monitoring report 4.4 school board chair's role, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right.
And now Dawn is authorized to sign the report that you approved that she wrote of herself.
How's that for checks and balances?
Howard would not like this.
See, we're gonna get that survey. Yeah, you all did. And I was fully open to anyone's comments or concerns. We have an executive session, but we also have some public here, so if it's all right with everybody, I'll check with public comment and then we'll take care of our executive session.
Do we
Steve?
have to modify the board work plan?
Oh, sorry, I missed that one. Yep, that was, so that was specific. I did that one to address, as a way to address, some of the concerns and comments that I heard from board members at the last meeting about, and to help give the community engagement committee some direction. But my concern was that there was questions about how we have an interaction with certain groups of stakeholders that we don't have already. And so it occurred to me that under 4.3, if you read the language of 4.3, it talks specifically about outlining a plan for meeting with certain groups of stakeholders. And that's one of the reports that has an interpretation that wasn't done. So this would affect Allison, who does that report, and Jen and who was Erin? Oh, Sarah, who would do. So would you be willing to swap, you two? I can help Allison with yours if you need help, because it's kind of come sooner. So your report was due in December,
Yep.
and Allison's 4.3 is February. So if you guys would be willing, we can alter the board work plan and switch it so that we look at the agenda planning piece that's never been looked at,
The
but could
4.3.
address, 4.3 could address
For
some of the stakeholders. My guess is that most of that we're gonna be out of compliance of, just by the read on the language. But then it would allow us to put a plan in place, which may help the community engagement committee, and it may, like,
And advertising the form and all of those things.
yes, yeah, so,
Can I clarify?
sure.
So you want to still do 4.3, and we're gonna do 4.2, but we're swapping
Swapping
when
months.
they occur?
You're
So it would
swapping
be
months.
in January, February?
No, I wanna do it now.
June.
We're doing that one too.
So,
Don't get us
I just thought that may be a way for us to get get our work in line, and that might be helpful to everybody. So if you're agreeable to that, Patrick and I'll just make the change,
So
or
moved.
modify the board work plan. So Steve's making a motion to modify. Is there
I'll
a second? Jen? All right. All those in favor of modifying the board work plan and swapping 4.2 and 4.3, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Now's your chance, Allison. Any abstention? Okay, thanks for catching that.
Yes.
All right. Okay, as I was saying, I'll just check in about public comment, and then we can have our executive session, do our evaluation, and adjourn. There will be no action when we come out of executive session. So, public comment. Is there any public comment at this time?
I'd like to make a public comment. Yes. I'm Tom Larmouth. I am a Moncton resident, and I teach at Mount Abraham, and I'm speaking to you as the co-president of ANITA, which is the association. And I'm not sure what you know about the situation with our current health plan and the collapse for many people of having their claims rightfully filled. And so I did a little survey a while back, and at this point, as of November 1st, we had 15 staff members who are currently owed more than $1,000 of unrefined claims that haven't been responded to. We've had almost 20 people have been referred to collection agencies because they have not been reimbursed according to their claims. And so the big concern now is that as of January 1st, the HRA monies that all staff have are absorbed by the district. And the FSA money that teachers have, which most teachers build bridges, so if you have a family plan, it's $7,000 or a $5,000 deductible, the teacher or staff member is responsible for the first $750, and then the board has put $250 into an HRA. And so many teachers built a bridge to the HRA, and they put $750 into the FSA. The FSAs will also be gone as of January 1st. And so the concern of the association is that people are gonna be left hanging when this money gets reabsorbed. And so we're looking for assurance by the board. We prefer written assurance. Patrick has given us assurance that this won't be an issue, and we have changed our TPA, and I just went to a presentation of the new TPA, and they've assured us that they'll be able to make sure the situation doesn't develop next year. But we would really feel much stronger with a written assurance that the monies will be available to teachers until all teachers are made right in this year that's just happened. And for the HRA money, I know that shouldn't, basically what you just have to do is make sure that the HRA monies that come back to the district are then held and not reapplied to the HRAs for this coming year, but are held until all the claims are rectified. The FSA is a little more complicated though, because for people who haven't spent their FSAs, there's a $500 carry back, which we won't get until April 1st. But for some people, there's going to be an issue where they've put $750 in there, only going to get $500 back, and then if something happens between January 1st and April 1st, they're on the hook for that $500 till it comes back. So we would really like assurances from the board, who is ultimately responsible for our health care. We're not a party to the contract, and the board is the party to the health contract. That they assure us that people aren't going to be left out in the dark on this, and that all the people who have legitimate claims for insurance will see the full amount be returned to them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so as I said, we're going to need an executive session. This particular executive session is around the evaluation of an employee, our superintendent in this case, because it's that time of year kind of thing. So under Title I, VSA 5313A3, I need a motion to go into executive session and invite Patrick in to join us. After we come out of executive session, there'll be no action taken other than to complete our survey and adjourn the meeting.
I make a motion to go into executive session.
Okay, Andrew?
I'll second it.
Amy? All right. All those in favor of going into executive session, please say aye. Opposed? Any abstentions? All right, great, we're in.